The fire spat a shower of orange sparks against the cast iron grate. Gideon Blackwood sat perfectly still, his breathing shallow, watching the flames consume the thick parchment. His hands were ruined things.
They're
Knuckles
coming
scarred white
closer.
skin,
I
weathered
see
like
them.
old saddle
Steady
leather,
now.
and a
We hold the
persistent
line!
rhythmic tremor in his left thumb
The horde is
that
closing
never
in.
quite stopped.
How many?
He
Too
reached
many.
into
We
the
must
wooden
warn the
crate
village
beside
now.
his chair.
I'll rally
His
the men.
fingers brushed against a stack of heavy military-grade vellum. He pulled one out. The paper was stiff, the ink dark and precise. Topographical lines tracking the ridges of the Western Territories. Elevation markers. River bends. In clusters of small black squares. Settlements. Targets. Gideon didn't look at the squares. He looked at the fire. He tossed the map into the hearth. The parchment curled. The edges browned, then blackened, and finally ignited with a soft whoosh. The black squares vanished into white ash. He watched it burn until there was nothing left but glowing embers. Then he reached into the crate again. He did this every autumn. For 3 years, the ritual remained the same. Burn the past one grit at a time. The cold Wyoming wind howled outside the thick timber walls of his cabin, rattling the window panes, but the inside was suffocatingly hot. It smelled of beeswax wood smoke and the bitter tang of burning ink. He pulled the final map from the bottom of the crate, his trembling fingers stilled as they touched the edges. He didn't toss this one into the fire. He couldn't. He held it in his lap, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched near his ear. His thumb traced the bottom right corner where 2 initials were elegantly inscribed in black ink. GB. He closed his eyes. The smell of the burning ink in the fireplace suddenly shifted in his mind, replaced by the scent of spring flowers and burning pine. The scent of a valley turned to cinders. Gideon's chest tightened. He folded the map. Once. Twice. He stood up, his knees popping in the quiet room. He walked over to the heavy canvas coat hanging on a rusted iron nail by the door. He slipped the folded map deep into the inner lining, right against where his ribs would sit. Then the dogs didn't bark because he didn't own any. The bees in the hives out back were dormant in the cold. The only warning was the sound itself, a heavy, wet thud against the front gate. Gideon froze. He lived 7 miles outside Oak Haven at the edge of the wilderness. Nobody came out here, especially not at night in the middle of a freezing October downpour. Another thud, weaker this time. Then the sound of sliding wood, as if something heavy was dragging itself down the face of his reinforced gate. He didn't rush. He moved with the deliberate heavy grace of a man who had survived too many ambushes. He reached above the doorframe and took down the Winchester repeater. He checked the action by feel in the dim light. Loaded. He grabbed a kerosene lantern, turned the wick up just enough to cast a glow, and stepped out into the freezing rain. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The mud sucked at his boots as he crossed the yard, the rain slicking his graying hair to his forehead. He stopped 3 paces from the gate. "State your business," Gideon called out. His voice was gravelly, unused. Only the wind answered. Gideon leveled the rifle, holding it steady despite the cold, and unlatched the heavy iron bar with his left hand. He pulled the gate open and raised the lantern. The yellow light spilled out onto the muddy road, illuminating a tangled mass of gray-green skin, ragged leather, and dark blood. 5 of them. Orcs. They were huddled against the driving rain, a desperate formation of broken bodies. In the frontier territories, an orc was a rare sight and a walking bounty. They were the ghosts of the plains, hunted, displaced, and despised. And 5 females alone meant a slaughter had happened somewhere up north. The one at the front stood up. She didn't cower from the lantern light or the barrel of the Winchester. She was a head taller than Gideon, her frame built for war, but she was starving. Her olive-green skin was stretched tight over her cheekbones, and a jagged, fresh scar ran from her jawline down her neck, disappearing into a patchwork leather tunic. Rainwater ran down her heavy braids. She looked at the rifle, then up into Gideon's eyes. Her eyes were striking. Amber. Unbroken. She carried the weight of a commander who had lost her army but refused to lose her dignity. "We need your barn," she said. Her English was rough syllables, clipped but perfectly clear. No pleading, no begging, a statement of transaction. Gideon kept the rifle steady. He looked past her. Behind her stood a heavily armored silent warrior, her hand resting instinctively on the pommel of a rusted blade. Nyx. Next to her, a younger one, eyes darting like a trapped wolf, radiating defiance despite her shivering. Kalia. Beside them, an elder, her face a roadmap of deep wrinkles and old grief leaning heavily on a wooden staff. Mara. And finally, the one leaning against the fence post. Runa. She wasn't standing under her own power. Her breathing was ragged, a wet, shallow rattling that cut through the sound of the rain. Gideon brought his gaze back to the tall one in front. The roof on the east side is collapsed, Gideon said. The tall orc didn't blink. He will patch it. We will work your land, repair your fences. 7 days of labor for shelter. Gideon stared at her. He didn't ask where they came from. He didn't ask who was hunting them. In the West, questions usually just sped up the dying. He looked at the blood seeping into the mud at her boots. My name is Vespera, she said, mistaking his silence for hesitation. We are not thieves. I didn't ask your name, Gideon said. He lowered the rifle. He stepped back, leaving the gate wide open. The water pump is around back. There's dry straw in the stalls. Don't touch the white wooden boxes on the south hill. Those are my bees. They don't care if you've had a hard week. Vespera stared at him. Humans didn't open doors for her kind. They opened fire. She searched his weathered face for a trap for the cruelty she had come to expect from every man in this territory. She found nothing but a hollow, tired emptiness. You let monsters into your yard, beekeeper, Vespera warned softly. I've seen monsters, Gideon replied, turning his back to her. They don't ask to fix the roof. He walked back to the house. He didn't look back to see if they followed. He knew they would. Desperation didn't have the luxury of pride. Inside, Gideon set the rifle back above the door. He stoked the fire, adding 3 thick logs of split oak. He went to the pantry and pulled out a heavy sack of oats, a cured ham hock, and a jar of crystallized honey. He carried the food out to the covered back porch and set it on the dry floorboards. He didn't hand it to them. He didn't want their gratitude. He just wanted them to survive the night. He stood in the shadows of the porch and watched them drag themselves into the ruined barn. Vespera carried the injured one, Runa, in her arms. As she passed the light of the barn's doorway, Gideon's eyes locked onto Runa's right leg. His breath caught. The fabric of Runa's trousers was torn away below the knee. The flesh wasn't just wounded, it was necrotic. A deep, unnatural blackness was spreading up her calf from a jagged puncture wound. The smell reached him a moment later across the wet yard, sickly sweet like rotting fruit and rusted iron. Swamp fever, a pathogen specific to the deep bogs deadly to orc biology. Gideon backed into his kitchen. He knew that wound. He had seen it tear through native auxiliaries during the border campaigns. Human medicine, carbolic acid bandages, whiskey would do absolutely nothing. It would only make her die in agony. By sunrise, the black veins would reach her heart. She would drown in her own blood. There was only one thing that stopped it. Blackroot, a parasitic plant that grew exclusively in the darkest, most stagnant corners of the Grey Vale, a treacherous stretch of marshland 4 miles south of his property line. A place where the mud was deep enough to swallow a horse, and the timber wolves hunted in packs of 20. Gideon looked at the clock on the mantel. 10:30. He looked at his hands. The tremor in his left thumb was violent now. He clenched his fist to stop it. He didn't owe them anything. He had given them shelter. He had given them food. That was more than any man in 100 miles would do. If the girl died, they would bury her out back and they would move on. That was the law of the frontier. He closed his eyes, but the face he saw wasn't Runa's. It was the face of a child in a burning valley screaming through the smoke. Gideon opened his eyes. He walked to the heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He didn't pull out the coat. He pulled out a thick, waxed canvas slicker, a pair of heavy leather waders, and a coiled rope. He grabbed a hunting knife with a bone handle and strapped it to his thigh. He took the Winchester down again, stuffing his pockets with brass cartridges. He didn't go to the barn to tell them. He didn't ask for permission. Gideon slipped out the back door, melting into the storm. The trek to the Grey Vale was brutal. The rain turned the rolling hills into slick, treacherous slides of mud. Gideon's lungs burned in his chest, the cold air scraping his throat like crushed glass. But his pace never slowed. He moved with a mechanical, relentless efficiency, his body remembering the forced marches of his past life. By midnight, the trees changed. The sturdy oaks gave way to twisted, rotting cypress. The smell of the air turned foul. The ground beneath his boots grew soft, yielding, trying to pull him down. He had entered the mire. Gideon lit a shielded bullseye lantern. The narrow beam of light cut through the driving rain and the rising swamp mist. He waded into knee-deep black water, ice cold. It bit through his leather waders instantly. He needed deadfall. Blackroot only grew under the submerged rot of fallen cypress trees. He swept the lantern beam across the dark water. Shadows danced and twisted between the trunks. He heard the splash of something heavy sliding off a bank nearby. He ignored it. His eyes were locked on the waterline. There, a massive trunk, half submerged, covered in thick green moss. Gideon waded deeper. The water rose to his thighs, then his waist. The cold was paralyzing. His chest seized, fighting for breath. He reached the log and plunged his bare hands into the freezing, murky water, feeling along the slick, rotting bark underneath. Nothing but slime. He moved down the trunk. The water was up to his chest now. The rain beat relentlessly against his hat. He heard a low, guttural growl from the bank. A wolf, and not alone. He could see the reflection of eyes in the periphery of his lantern light. 2 pairs. 4. Gideon didn't draw his rifle. He didn't have time. He plunged his hands deeper into the freezing muck beneath the log. His fingers brushed against something tough, fibrous, and covered in sharp thorns. Blackroot. The thorns sliced into his palms, but Gideon didn't flinch. He gripped the thick cluster of roots and pulled. The mud resisted, creating a vacuum that refused to let go. He braced his boot against the sunken log, his muscles straining, the veins in his neck bulging. With a sickening squelch, the root cluster broke free. Gideon stumbled backward into the water, clutching a tangled mass of black, spiky tubers. He shoved them into his canvas sack. The growling grew louder. One of the wolves stepped into the water bearing yellow teeth. Gideon pulled the Winchester from his shoulder. He didn't aim at the wolf. He aimed at a dead, hollow tree stump 5 yards to its left. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot in the swamp was deafening, a localized explosion of thunder and muzzle flash. The hollow stump shattered, sending wood splinters flying. The wolves yelped, spooked by the sheer concussive force and the blinding flash in the dark, and scrambled back up the bank, disappearing into the brush. Gideon didn't wait to see if they would return. He turned and began the agonizing slog back towards solid ground. It was past 3 in the morning when the silhouette of his cabin emerged from the rain. Gideon was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, his lips tinged blue. He bypassed his house entirely and walked straight to the barn. The massive wooden door was pulled shut. He shoved it open. The air inside was warm, smelling of wet wool livestock, and the heavy stench of Runa's dying leg. A single lantern burned low in the corner. Instantly, Nyx was on her feet, the rusted blade of her sword leveled perfectly at Gideon's throat. She moved with terrifying speed, making no sound. Gideon didn't raise his hands. He didn't even look at the blade. He looked past her to where Mara the Elder was kneeling over Runa. Runa was unconscious, her skin a pallid ashen gray. Vespera stood nearby, her massive fist clenched in helpless rage at her inability to save her soldier. Gideon reached into his soaked canvas sack. He pulled out the cluster of blackroot. It was still dripping with swamp mud and his own blood from the thorn cuts. He tossed it onto the straw at Mara's feet. The elder orc froze. She looked down at the twisted black roots, then up at Gideon. Her weathered eyes widened in absolute shock. "Mash it," Gideon grunted, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Boil the thickest tubers. Apply the pulp directly to the rot. Make her drink the runoff." Vespera stared at the roots, then looked at Gideon. She saw the mud caked up to his chest. She saw the bleeding cuts on his palms. She saw the sheer exhaustion in his hollow eyes. "How does a human know the medicine of the Gray tribes?" Vespera asked, her voice tight with suspicion, yet laced with an undeniable awe. "Humans do not know this root. They do not survive the mire to pick it." "Grind it down before she loses the leg," Gideon said, ignoring the question. He turned and walked out of the barn, pulling the door shut behind him. He crossed the yard, stripped off his freezing, mud-caked waders on the porch, and stumbled inside. He was too exhausted to start a fire. He was too cold to feel his fingers. He collapsed into the wooden chair by the dead hearth, wrapping a heavy wool blanket around his shivering shoulders, and closed his eyes. Back in the barn, the silence was heavy. Mara wasted no time. She grabbed a flat stone and began crushing the blackroot. The pungent smell of iron and damp earth filled the barn. It was the smell of home. the smell of salvation. He went into the dark for us, Mora whispered, her hands working furiously, for a stranger. Vespera watched the door where the human had disappeared. Her mind raced. The men of this world took. They burned. They conquered. They did not bleed in the freezing mud to save an orc. Keep watch, Vespera ordered Nyx. If he comes back, wake me. But Gideon didn't come back. The night stretched on. The rain hammered against the patched roof. Mora applied the steaming black poultice to Runa's leg. Almost immediately, the rattling in Runa's chest eased. The necrotic black veins stopped their march upward and slowly began to recede. The medicine was working. By the time the first gray light of dawn threatened to break over the eastern ridge, the storm had finally passed. The barn was quiet. Vespera, exhausted by the day's trauma, leaned against the stall and drifted into a fitful sleep. Nyx stood guard at the door, still as a statue. Only Kalia remained restless. The youngest of the 5 Kalia was born into the aftermath of the wars. She only knew running, hiding, and the cruelty of human faces. She didn't believe in acts of grace. She believed in traps. A man who gives without asking wants to take everything later. She slipped out of the barn through a loose board in the back wall. The yard was muddy and silent. She crept toward the main cabin. The back door was unlatched. She pushed it open, wincing as the hinges gave a faint creak. The kitchen was dark. She moved silently across the floorboards, her bare feet making no sound. She peeked into the main living area. Gideon was asleep in the chair by the cold fireplace. He looked older in sleep, defeated. The heavy wool blanket had slipped off one shoulder. Kalia didn't look at him long. Her eyes scanned the room. A modest life, a simple life. But she needed to know who they were indebted to. She crept into the small adjoining bedroom. It was Spartan. A neatly made bed, a wash basin, and at the foot of the bed, a heavy wooden trunk bound in iron. Kalia knelt beside it. It wasn't locked. She lifted the lid slowly, ensuring it didn't squeak. Inside, there were folded work shirts, a few tools, a box of rifle ammunition. Nothing out of the ordinary. She almost closed it, but her fingers brushed against something at the very bottom, wrapped carefully in oiled canvas. She pulled the canvas back. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was a piece of fabric, heavy dark blue wool. Kalia pulled it out into the dim light creeping through the window. It was a uniform jacket, her eyes fixed on the buttons. Tarnished brass stamped with the eagle of the Federal Army. But it was the insignia patched onto the left breast that made the blood freeze in Kalia's veins. A silver compass set over 2 crossed quill pens. It wasn't the insignia of the infantry, or the cavalry, or the border patrol. Kalia had grown up listening to the stories from the elders around dying campfires. The stories of the men who came before the soldiers. The men who stood on the hills with their brass instruments and their notebooks. The men who drew the lines that told the cannons where to fire. The Federal Cartography Corps. The map makers. The architects of the Great Orc Purges. Kalia's hands shook. The heavy fabric felt like poison against her skin. The man sleeping in the next room, the man who had waded into the freezing swamp to save Runa, was a soldier of the Corps. He was one of the men who had mapped their extinction. She looked toward the open doorway, staring into the dark living room where Gideon slept. The silence of the house no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a grave. Kalia shoved the uniform back into the trunk. She dropped the canvas over it, closed the lid, and backed out of the room. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slipped out the back door, running across the muddy yard as the first rays of morning light hit the white wooden boxes of the beehives. The crisis of the leg had passed, but the true danger had just been unearthed. The man who had given them sanctuary was the very man who had built the world that destroyed them. The sun rose over the Wyoming frontier, casting long, sharp shadows over the farm, and in the barn, 5 orcs were about to wake up in the house of their enemy. Morning broke over the Wyoming ridge like a bruised eye, all streaks of purple and dull aching yellow. The storm had passed, leaving the frontier washed clean and smelling of wet pine and crushed sage. Inside the cabin, Gideon was already awake. He hadn't slept. He stood by the cast iron stove, listening to the water come to a boil. He reached into the cupboard. His left hand trembled, the persistent tremor radiating through his thumb. He took down a tin cup, then another. He lined them up on the heavy oak table. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He poured the black, bitter chicory coffee into his own cup, leaving the other 5 empty. but waiting. He didn't call out to the barn. He didn't announce breakfast. He just left the cups on the table, a silent treaty etched in tin and silence. Outside the farm was already breathing. Gideon walked out onto the porch, a steaming cup in his hand. The mud of the yard was tracked with heavy footprints. He looked toward the southern perimeter. Vespera was working. She had found a stack of untreated cedar posts he had cut the previous spring. The posts were heavy, meant to be driven into the earth with a 20-pound iron maul. Vespera wasn't using the maul. She stood knee-deep in the damp frontier soil, her shoulders rolling beneath her soaked leather tunic. She lifted a massive cedar post, squared it over the post hole, and drove it downward with raw, terrifying kinetic force. The wood slammed into the earth with a deep thud. She gripped the top of the post and drove it again, the muscles in her back shifting like shifting plates of armor. Gideon watched her. He didn't marvel and he didn't intrude. He simply recognized the work of a soldier translating war into labor. He set his coffee down and walked to the white wooden boxes on the gentle rise behind the cabin. The beehives. He didn't wear a veil. He lit the burlap inside his copper smoker, pumping the bellows until a thick, sweet-smelling white cloud drifted over the colony. He moved with excruciating slowness, his scarred, trembling hands suddenly steady as he lifted the wooden frames. The bees swarmed over his knuckles, an angry buzzing mass that slowly calmed under the smoke. Across the yard, Vespera paused. She rested her hand on the freshly driven fence post, watching the man. He was a contradiction, a human with the scarred, trembling hands of a killer, working with the gentlest precision among thousands of stinging insects. He didn't look at her. He didn't demand her gratitude for the blackroot that had saved Runa's life. He just demanded that the fence be straight. A silent rhythm settled over the farm. 3 days passed. The transaction of survival turned into a routine. The orcs worked the land. Nyx chopped cordwood until her hands bled her, silence unbroken. Mara tended to Runa in the barn, changing the black poultice until the rot finally retreated, leaving raw pink healing flesh. And every morning Gideon set out 6 cups. By the 4th day, the tension in the cabin had changed. It wasn't gone, but it had pulled tight like a wire waiting to snap. It snapped in the kitchen. Gideon was standing at the butcher block slicing a heavy loaf of sourdough. The metallic shink of the knife against the wood was the only sound in the room. Vespera stood by the doorway, her arms crossed, watching him. From the shadows of the hallway, Kalia stepped forward. The youngest orc stood rigid, her chin tilted up in an attitude of absolute aggressive defiance. She held something in her hand. She walked to the table and slammed a small glass jar down onto the wood. The salt cellar. "I didn't borrow it," Kalia said. Her voice was sharp, a challenge thrown onto the floor, waiting for the human to pick it up. "I stole it. On the first night. I took it and I hid it." She braced herself. She knew how humans reacted to theft. She expected a backhand. She expected the Winchester to come down from the wall. She expected to be thrown out into the mud. Gideon didn't stop slicing the bread. He didn't look up. His face remained a mask of worn leather and gray stubble. The knife bit cleanly through the crust. "Keep it," Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Kalia frowned, thrown off balance. "I am a thief." Gideon finally stopped. He rested the knife on the board. He looked at the half-empty jar of salt, then looked at the young, furious orc. "I'll just deduct it from your federal tax," Gideon deadpanned. For a second, there was nothing but the crackle of the stove. Then from the doorway, a sound broke the silence. It started low, a rumble deep in Vespera's chest. It caught in her throat, snagging on years of grief and disuse before breaking free. She laughed. It was a rough, dry barking sound. It wasn't elegant. It was the laugh of a survivor, rusty and sharp, but it was genuine. It filled the small kitchen, bouncing off the timber walls, a sudden shocking burst of light in a room that had been dark for 3 years. Kalia stared at her leader in horror. Gideon froze. The knife slipped from the butcher block and clattered loudly against the floorboards. The slice of bread fell from his hand. Gideon's left hand seized. The tremor erupted into a violent, uncontrollable shake. He grabbed his own wrist with his right hand, squeezing hard enough to bruise, trying to force the muscles to obey. He stared blindly at the flour-dusted wood. He hadn't heard an orc laugh, not since before the fires, not since before the lines were drawn on the parchment. The sound bypassed his mind and struck him directly in the marrow. It was the sound of a living soul, the sound his pen had systematically erased from the world. His breathing turned ragged. He didn't look at Vespera. He didn't pick up the knife. He turned sharply on his heel, pushed past Kalia and walked out the back door. The screen door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing across the quiet yard. Vespera's smile vanished. She watched him walk away, her amber eyes narrowing. Humans were fragile, unpredictable creatures. But that wasn't anger she had seen in his eyes. That was terror. That evening, the air cooled, bringing the crisp bite of late autumn. Gideon was sitting on the top step of the back porch. The darkness hid the trembling of his hands. He was smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, the cherry glowing dull red in the shadows. The wooden planks groaned. Vespera sat down on the steps, leaving a careful distance between them. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the fireflies dance above the tall grass near the tree line. "She is walking," Vespera said softly. Gideon didn't look at her. "Keep her off it for another 2 days. The muscle needs to knit. She would be dead in the mud without you." "The swamp grew the root," Gideon said, taking a slow drag of tobacco. "I just pulled it." Vespera looked at the side of his face, the deep lines around his eyes, the permanent tension in his jaw. "You do not ask why we were on the road," she said, "because it doesn't matter. It matters to the dead." Gideon flinched, a microscopic tightening of his shoulders. Vespera leaned her forearms on her knees, staring out into the black timberline. 22 years ago. Ash Valley, it was a settlement by the river fork. 60 families. My father was the chieftain. The cherry of Gideon's cigarette burned hot, almost reaching his fingers. He didn't move. "The humans didn't come with guns first." Vespera continued, her voice devoid of inflection, which made the words cut deeper. "They came with brass tripods. They came with measuring chains and notebooks. They smiled. They asked for water. They walked our borders and drew lines on their heavy paper. We thought they were merchants." Gideon closed his eyes. The smoke from his cigarette tasted like ash. "3 weeks later, the cavalry came," Vespera said. "In the middle of the night. No demands, no treaties, just torches and phosphorus. They locked the doors of the longhouses from the outside. They burned the crops. They burned the children. The crickets in the yard seemed to stop chirping. My mother carried me into the river," Vespera whispered. "I was submerged in the water, looking up at the sky. I remember the smell. The fruit trees had just blossomed that week. The air smelled of spring flowers, burning pine, and roasting meat." She turned her head to look at him. "Do you know what it is like, beekeeper, to smell spring and only think of the grave?" Gideon didn't answer. He couldn't. He stood up so fast the wooden chair scraped violently against the porch. He didn't look at her. He dropped the cigarette and walked away, his boots heavy on the packed dirt. He walked past the beehives. He walked past the barn. He stopped behind the old stone well, out of sight from the porch. He fell to his knees in the wet grass. His stomach violently contracted. He doubled over, vomiting into the weeds. His body convulsed, rejecting the air, rejecting the memory. He gagged until there was nothing left, spitting bitter bile into the dirt, his hands digging into the earth like he was trying to bury himself. From the porch, Vespera listened to the sound of the man retching in the dark. She felt a strange pang of sympathy, a human with a soft stomach, a man who couldn't even hear the stories of the frontier without growing physically ill. He was weak, she thought, good but weak. He had no stomach for the cruelty of the world. She didn't know the sickness wasn't empathy. She didn't know it was the crushing, suffocating weight of a murderer staring at his own ghost. The next afternoon, the sun beat down with a late-season intensity, baking the moisture out of the cedar shingles. Gideon and Vespera were on the roof of the barn. The work required proximity. Gideon was straddling the roof peak, prying up the rotted wood with a crowbar. Vespera was positioned just beneath him, passing up the fresh shingles and holding them flush against the joists while he drove the nails. They worked like a machine. Pass, hold, strike. Gideon reached down for the next bundle of cedar. Vespera reached up to hand it to him. The heavy stack of wood shifted. They both lunged to catch it. Vespera's large calloused hand clamped down over Gideon's forearm to steady him. Her grip pulled the heavy canvas sleeve of his work shirt up toward his elbow. Vespera froze. She didn't let go of the wood, but her eyes were locked on his exposed arm. From his wrist, disappearing high past his elbow, the skin was destroyed. It was a massive, horrific burn scar. The flesh was melted, roped, and violently discolored. A chaotic topography of pink and white tissue that looked like wax dripped over bone. It was the kind of burn a man only gets from being too close to an inferno, from pulling something out of a fire he had no business surviving. Gideon saw her staring. He ripped his arm away from her grasp. He didn't say a word. He violently yanked his sleeve back down, buttoning the cuff at his wrist with shaking, clumsy fingers. He grabbed the hammer and drove a nail into the cedar with enough force to split the wood. Vespera watched his jaw clench. She looked at the fresh wood. A burn scar. A man who lives alone in the middle of nowhere. A man who knows orc medicine. A man who throws up at the mention of the Ash Valley fires. She thought she understood him then. She thought she saw the shape of his trauma. He was a survivor too. Perhaps a settler caught in a raid. Perhaps a man who had lost his own family to the flames. The scar was a bridge between them, an unspoken language of pain. She handed him the next shingle. This time her fingers brushed the canvas of his sleeve, a fleeting, almost imperceptible gesture of solidarity. Gideon didn't look at her. He just kept hammering, driving the nails deep into the wood, trying to nail down a pass that was already prying itself loose. By late afternoon, the clouds returned, rolling over the ridges thick and gray. The temperature plummeted. Gideon had left his heavy canvas coat draped over a wooden sawhorse inside the barn while he worked the roof. Inside the barn, the air was quiet. Mara was out back drawing water. Nix was patrolling the perimeter. Vespera sat on a bale of hay near Runa, who was awake and propped up against the wall, a piece of charcoal in her hand. Runa was sketching on the rough planks of the barn wall. She wasn't drawing the farm. She was drawing a river. She was drawing the outlines of longhouses. "You remember the curvature of the riverbank?" Vespera said softly, watching the charcoal move. "I remember the stories," Runa corrected, coughing weakly. "I was not born when it burned. I only know what you tell me." Vespera looked down at her hands. "My father was the chieftain. I was supposed to lead a nation, Runa. I was supposed to lead warriors, not ghosts, not refugees." Runa stopped drawing. She reached out her fingers, searching for a piece of cloth to wipe the charcoal dust from her hands. She saw the heavy canvas coat draped over the sawhorse. She leaned over and grabbed the hem of the coat, using the rough fabric to wipe her fingers. As she pulled on the coat, something shifted inside the lining. The fabric was worn, the seam slightly frayed. Runa felt the sharp, stiff edge of heavy paper poking through the torn lining. Frowning, Runa reached her fingers into the gap. She pinched the stiff paper and pulled it out. It was a large, folded square of military vellum. "What is that?" Vespera asked, looking up. "It was in his coat," Runa said. She unfolded the paper. It was thick and crackled loudly in the quiet barn. She smoothed it out over her lap. Runa stared at the intricate black ink. She was an artist. Her brain processed shapes and spatial relationships faster than words. She saw the topographical lines. She saw the elevation markers. Then she saw the river. It was the exact curvature she had just drawn on the wall, the fork in the water, the ridge to the east. And drawn with clinical, devastating precision were 60 small black squares nestled in the valley. Runa's breath hitched. Her eyes widened, darting across the paper. She saw the military grid coordinates. She saw the red arrows indicating cavalry approach vectors. "Vespera." Runa's voice was a choked whisper. Vespera stood up. The tone in Runa's voice sent a spike of cold dread straight through her spine. She stepped over to the girl and looked down at the paper. Vespera couldn't read English words well, but she could read a map. Every orc child was taught to read the land. She saw the river. She saw the valley. She saw her home perfectly rendered in black ink, reduced to a tactical objective. Her amber eyes tracked to the bottom right corner of the vellum. There, stamped in faded blue ink, was the insignia of the Federal Army, and beneath it a silver compass over 2 crossed quills, and beneath that the cartographer's signature. Crisp, methodical, undeniable. G. Blackwood. Vespera stopped breathing. The sound of the rain starting to beat against the newly repaired cedar roof vanished from her ears. The smell of the hay and the horses faded away. She was back in the water. She was smelling the phosphorus. She was hearing her father scream as the longhouse roof collapsed inward. The man on the porch, The trembling hands, the vomit in the grass, the burn scar. It wasn't empathy. It wasn't shared trauma. It was guilt. The man who had waded into the freezing swamp to save her soldier. The man who had set 6 cups on the table every morning. The man who had given them his barn and his food. He was the architect of their genocide. Vespera reached down, her massive hand clamped around the edge of the vellum map. Her knuckles turned white, her jaw locked with a force that threatened to crack her own teeth. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked toward the barn doors. Through the cracks in the wood, she could see the silhouette of Gideon Blackwood walking across the yard, his head bowed against the rain. The sanctuary was a lie. The farm was a graveyard. And the man who owned it was the devil himself. The vellum map felt heavier than iron in Vespera's hand. She stood in the center of the barn, the ambient sounds of the farm fading into a dull rushing roar in her ears. The scent of rain and wet cedar vanished, replaced by the phantom stench of burning pine and scorched earth. Her amber eyes remained fixed on the elegant damning signature at the bottom right corner of the grid. Gideon Blackwood, the man who had given them his barn, the man who had waded into the freezing swamp to save Runa's leg, the man who had set 6 tin cups on his table every morning, waiting in silence. He was the mapmaker. He was the architect of Ash Valley's destruction. Nyx shifted in the shadows. The silent warrior saw the change in Vespera's posture. She saw the way the muscles in her chieftain's massive back coiled tight as wound springs. Nyx's hand dropped to the rusted pommel of her sword. She didn't know what was on the paper, but she knew the look of an executioner stepping up to the block. Vespera crushed the map in her fist. She turned toward the barn doors. She didn't walk, she marched. Every step was heavy, driving into the dirt floor with the force of 22 years of buried grief. She was going to tear the doors off their iron hinges. She was going to cross the muddy yard walk into that warm, quiet cabin and wrap her hands around the trembling throat of the man who had drawn the lines that slaughtered her family. Her hand hit the heavy timber of the barn door. Then the ground vibrated. It wasn't a subtle tremor. It was the rhythmic, concussive thud of heavy hooves striking packed dirt. Not one horse, many. They were moving fast, churning up the mud on the southern road leading to the farm. Vespera froze. The feral rage in her eyes snapped into sharp, tactical focus. She pushed the barn door open just an inch. Through the narrow crack, she saw them breaking through the tree line. 10 riders, men in heavy duster coats, water pouring off the brims of their slouch hats. They rode with the aggressive, sprawling posture of men who owned the territory and everything bleeding on it. At the front rode Mayor Thaddeus. He was a thick, bull-necked man who wore his authority like a loaded revolver. He didn't slow his roan stallion as he approached the reinforced wooden gate of the farm. He simply spurred the beast forward, the horse's chest slamming into the timber, bursting the latch in a shower of splintered wood. The riders flooded into the yard, fanning out in a calculated half circle. They pulled back hard on their reins. The horses danced and snorted in the cold air, their breath rising in thick white plumes. Leather creaked, metal clacked. 5 shotguns and 5 lever-action rifles were drawn from their scabbards. 10 barrels leveled at the barn and at the quiet cabin. From the front porch of the cabin, the screen door whined on its hinges. Gideon Blackwood stepped out. He didn't wear his canvas coat. He wore a simple faded work shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his forearms. His hands were empty. The persistent tremor in his left thumb was visible even from the barn. He stood on the top step, his face impassive, looking at the 10 armed men tearing up his front yard. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired, like a man who had been waiting for the devil to finally collect his due. "You're a long way from the courthouse, Thaddeus." Gideon's voice was gravel, barely carrying over the sound of the rain and stamping hooves. Mayor Thaddeus spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the mud. He rested the butt of his shotgun on his thigh, the barrel pointing toward the gray sky. "I told you last month, Blackwood," Thaddeus called out, his voice booming with practiced frontier arrogance. "I told you we don't abide strays in Oakhaven. We don't abide the diseased, and we sure as hell don't abide the greenskins." Gideon didn't move. "My property line is 7 miles north of your town limits. What happens on this dirt is my business." "Not anymore," Thaddeus sneered. He reached inside his heavy wool duster and pulled out a folded piece of yellow telegraph paper. He held it up in the rain. "Word travels, Gideon, even out here. Someone in town recognized the brand on the horses you've been buying feed for." Orc mounts, skin and bones, but orc all the same. In the barn, Vespera watched through the crack. Nyx drew her blade, the rusted steel sliding silently from its sheath. Mora stood over Runa, her weathered hands gripping a pitchfork. Kalia was already climbing the loft ladder, her eyes searching for a vantage point. They were ready to die, but they would drag half these men down into the mud with them. Thaddeus spurred his horse 2 steps closer to the porch. He looked past Gideon, his eyes scanning the dark gaps in the barn walls. "Bring 'em out, Blackwood," Thaddeus ordered. "We're taking them to the territorial line. If they survive the march, that's God's will. If they don't, it's just pest control. You hand them over and we ride away." Gideon looked at the 10 men. He looked at the shotguns. His left hand shook. He pressed it flat against his thigh to stop it. "No," Gideon said. It was a quiet word, but it dropped into the muddy yard like an anvil. Thaddeus let out a sharp, incredulous bark of a laugh. He looked back at his men, shaking his head. "No," Thaddeus echoed. He turned his stallion broadside to the porch. His eyes narrowed, the mockery fading into genuine venom. "You think you're some kind of savior, Gideon? You think you're standing up for the downtrodden?" Thaddeus shook the yellow telegraph paper in the air. "I wired the federal outpost in Cheyenne," Thaddeus shouted, his voice designed to carry straight into the timber walls of the barn. "I asked them who exactly was living out here playing nursemaid to a pack of fugitive animals. They sent me your file." Gideon's jaw locked. The color drained from his weathered face, leaving it the color of old ash. "You hear me in there?" Thaddeus bellowed at the barn. "You green-skinned freaks! You think this man is your friend? You think he took you in out of the goodness of his heart?" Thaddeus snapped the paper open. "Gideon Blackwood, Captain, Federal Cartography Corps." Thaddeus read, his voice dripping with sadistic glee. "Lead surveyor for the Western Expansion. He didn't just fight in the border wars. He drew the maps that burned your villages down to the bedrock." Thaddeus crumpled the paper and threw it into the mud. He leveled a thick finger at Gideon. "He's the butcher of Ash Valley. He mapped the river. He marked the targets. He handed the coordinates to the artillery and went to sleep while your people burned in their beds." Silence descended on the yard. It was absolute, suffocating, and heavy with the weight of 22 years of ghosts. Even the horses stopped stamping. Thaddeus looked at Gideon, a cruel smile stretching beneath his thick mustache. He had stripped the armor off the protector. He had exposed the ultimate betrayal. He waited for the orcs to tear the cabin apart from the inside or to flee into the timber. Gideon didn't deny it. He didn't shout. He didn't defend himself. He stood on the porch, his shoulders slightly stooped, accepting the public execution of his soul. Every word Thaddeus spoke was the absolute truth. He was a monster who had tried to hide among his bees and his quiet routines, hoping the world would forget the ink on his hands. But the ink never washed off. Gideon looked down at his trembling hands. Then he looked up at the 10 gun barrels pointed at his home. He turned around. He walked back into the cabin. The screen door slammed shut behind him. Thaddeus laughed out loud. "Look at him, coward, runs the second the truth is out. Let's burn the barn, boys. Smoke 'em out." The riders raised their rifles, the metallic clatter of hammers being cocked echoing across the yard. The cabin door kicked open. It hit the exterior wall with a crack like a cannon shot. Gideon stepped back out onto the porch. He wasn't empty-handed anymore. He held the heavy Winchester repeater, but he wasn't holding it at his hip. He brought the stock to his shoulder. His left hand, the hand that had trembled for 3 years, gripped the wooden forend of the rifle with a sudden, terrifying, absolute stillness. He racked the lever. The heavy brass cartridge slid into the chamber with a precise, lethal snick. Gideon didn't aim at the sky. He aimed directly at the center of Mayor Thaddeus's chest. "They stay," Gideon said. His voice wasn't gravelly anymore. It was cold. It was the voice of the federal captain who had survived the deepest swamps and the bloodiest ridges of the frontier. It was the voice of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Thaddeus's smile vanished. The color drained from his face as he stared down the dark hollow bore of the Winchester. "You're out of your mind, Blackwood," Thaddeus hissed. "You're one man. We're 10. You pull that trigger, you'll be cut to ribbons before the brass hits the floorboards." "I know," Gideon said. The rifle didn't waver a fraction of an inch. "I'll be dead, but you'll be the first to join me in hell, Thaddeus, and the man to your left will be second. Who wants to be third?" The riders hesitated. The swagger evaporated from their posture. They were bullies. They were lynch mobs. They were used to shooting at shadows and running down the starving. They were not used to looking into the eyes of a man who was eagerly inviting his own death just to take them with him. "Shoot him!" Thaddeus screamed, panic rising in his throat as he realized Gideon wasn't bluffing. The men tightened their grips on their triggers. A sound shattered the tension. The heavy timber doors of the barn didn't just open. They were blown off their hinges. The wood splintered and cracked as a massive force slammed into them from the inside. Vespera stepped out into the rain. She didn't have a rifle. She didn't have a sword. But as she walked into the muddy yard, she commanded the space with the gravity of a falling mountain. Her amber eyes were burning, locked not on the 10 men on horseback, but on the back of Gideon's head. She held the crumpled vellum map in her left hand. Behind her, Nyx fanned out to the left, her rusted blade drawn, her body perfectly balanced for violence. Kalia dropped from the loft window to the right, a heavy iron pitchfork in her hands. Mara stood in the doorway, an immovable anchor. Vespera walked straight toward the porch. Thaddeus's men swung their rifles toward her. "Hold your fire!" Thaddeus yelled, raising his hand. He looked at Vespera, then at Gideon, a sickening realization dawning on him. He saw the map in her hand. He saw the pure, unadulterated fury radiating from the orc chieftain. Thaddeus smiled again, a greasy, desperate grin. "You see that blackwood?" Thaddeus taunted, lowering his shotgun slightly. "You don't even have to die by our hands. She knows. The greenskin knows exactly what you are. She's going to tear your head off your shoulders for us." Vespera reached the bottom of the porch steps. She was a foot taller than Gideon. She looked at the frail, aging human holding the rifle. She looked at the terrible burn scar visible on his forearm. She unspooled the crumpled vellum map. She held it up, the black ink of Ash Valley clearly visible in the gray light. "You drew this," Vespera's voice was a low guttural rumble. It wasn't a question. Gideon didn't lower his rifle. He kept it aimed at Thaddeus, but his eyes flicked to the map, then back to the mayor. "I drew it," Gideon said. His voice was hollow. "I mapped the river, I marked the houses, I signed the paper." He waited for the blow. He waited for the massive hands to wrap around his neck and snap his spine. It would be justice. It would be the penance he had been seeking for 22 years. Vespera looked at the man. She saw the tremor fighting to return to his hands. She saw the absolute lack of self-preservation in his eyes. He wasn't defending himself from her. He was only defending her from them. Vespera turned her back to Gideon. She stepped up onto the porch. She moved directly into his line of fire, placing her massive, scarred body squarely between the barrel of Gideon's Winchester and the 10 men in the yard. She became his shield. Thaddeus stared in stunned disbelief. His horse took a nervous step backward. "What the hell are you doing?" Thaddeus demanded, his voice cracking. "He slaughtered your people." Vespera looked at the 10 men. She looked at their clean clothes, their well-fed horses, their cowardly, trembling hands gripping their weapons. "He is a map maker," Vespera said. Her voice echoed across the valley, carrying the weight of a queen who had finally found her ground. "He drew the fire that burned my home." She lifted her right hand. The scars from the fire were visible, trailing up her neck. "But you, Butter," Vespera pointed at Thaddeus. "You come to my door with guns to kill my sick. You come to take my family. You offer nothing but a rope." Vespera reached back without looking. Her large hand found Gideon's shoulder. She gripped the rough canvas of his shirt. "This man," Vespera continued, her voice rising in volume and terrifying intensity, "waded into the dark water. He bled in the thorns. He pulled the root from the mud to save the life of my soldier. He gave us a roof. He gave us his fire." She squeezed Gideon's shoulder. "He drew the map, but he is mine." Vespera let the vellum map fall from her hand. It fluttered down into the deep mud of the yard, instantly soaked and ruined by the rain, the black squares bleeding into nothing. "If you want the beekeeper," Vespera roared, her voice tearing through the storm, "you will have to dig through my bones to get to him, and before I fall, I will break every spine in this yard." Who is first? Silence. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of absolute primal fear. Thaddeus looked at the giant orc warrior standing on the porch. He looked at the 3 orcs spreading out in the yard, their eyes feral and fixed on his men. He looked at the barrel of Gideon's rifle, still perfectly steady, peeking out from behind Vespera's massive arm. They were not a lynch mob anymore. They were prey. Thaddeus swallowed hard. His throat clicked audibly. He slowly, carefully slid his shotgun back into its leather scabbard. He didn't say a word. He didn't issue a threat. He simply reined his horse around. His men followed instantly. They couldn't get their rifles put away fast enough. The 10 riders spurred their horses back toward the tree line, kicking up mud in a desperate, frantic retreat. They rode as if the devil himself was chasing them, their silhouettes shrinking against the gray horizon until they disappeared entirely. The rhythmic thud of the hooves faded away. The only sound left was the rain falling on the cedar roof. On the porch, the adrenaline finally broke. Gideon lowered the Winchester. The moment the stock left his shoulder, the tremor returned with a vengeance. Both his hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the weapon. He leaned it against the wall, his knees buckling slightly. He had to brace his hands against his thighs to stay upright. Vespera stood frozen on the edge of the porch watching the tree line. Slowly she turned around. She looked at the broken man leaning against the timber wall, the man who had mapped her genocide. Gideon looked up at her. His eyes were red, hollowed out by the adrenaline and the terrible, crushing weight of the truth finally being spoken aloud. "Why?" Gideon asked. His voice was a broken whisper. "Why didn't you let them do it?" Vespera stepped closer to him. She towered over him, her shadow blocking out the gray light of the yard. "Because a quick death from cowards is too easy for you," Vespera said softly. She looked down at the mud where the map was dissolving into a dark puddle. "I will never forgive the man who held the pen," Vespera said. Her amber eyes met his and there was no warmth in them, only a hard, unbreakable truth. "Not today, not tomorrow. If I live 100 years, the mapmaker will always be my enemy." Gideon nodded slowly. The tears he had held back for 2 decades finally pooled in his eyes, not out of sadness, but out of a profound, devastating relief. He was finally condemned. "I understand," Gideon whispered. "You can take the horses. Take the wagon in the back. There are supplies in the cellar. You can be across the territorial line by midnight." Vesper stared at him. "Who said we were leaving?" she asked. Gideon blinked, confused. "But I am—" "You are a map maker," Vesper interrupted. "But the roof on the barn was leaking, and you climbed up in the rain to fix it. The fence was broken, and you handed me the wood." She stepped past him, pulling open the screen door to the cabin. She paused in the doorway and looked back at the exhausted, trembling human. "The world outside this fence is full of men who burn things down," Vesper said, her voice dropping to a low, steady rhythm. "I am tired of running from fires. The door opens both ways, Gideon. You opened it the wrong way 22 years ago. You opened it the right way 4 nights ago." She looked toward the barn where Nix and Kalia were already walking back inside to tend to Runa. "I choose the second door," Vesper said. "I am staying at the beekeeper's farm." She walked into this cabin, leaving the door wide open behind her. Gideon stood alone on the porch for a long time. He looked out at the muddy yard. He looked at the white wooden boxes on the hill, safe and quiet in the rain. He looked down at his trembling hands. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his scarred lungs. He picked up the Winchester, checked the safety, and walked inside. 1 month later, the first heavy snow of winter had fallen over the Wyoming frontier. The ridges were painted blinding white, the pine trees sagging under the weight of the frost. The air was brutally cold, the kind of cold that snaps branches and freezes rivers solid. Inside the cabin, the cast-iron stove radiated a fierce, steady heat. The smell of baking sourdough and melting honeycomb filled the small room. Gideon stood by the counter. He moved slower now, the cold biting into his old joints. But the violent tremor in his left hand had dulled to a manageable, quiet vibration. He reached into the cupboard. He took down a tin cup. Then another. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He lined them up on the heavy oak table. He poured the steaming black coffee into the first cup. He heard the heavy boots on the porch. The screen door opened, letting in a blast of freezing wind before slamming shut. Vesper walked in carrying an armful of split oak logs. She wore a heavy canvas coat, Gideon's coat modified and stitched to fit her massive frame. She dumped the wood into the iron basket next to the stove, brushing the snow from her shoulders. She didn't say a word. She walked to the table. She pulled out a chair, the wood groaning under her weight. She sat down. Gideon picked up the heavy metal percolator. He didn't ask. He simply moved to the table and poured the steaming black liquid into the second tin cup. Then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. Vespera watched the steam rise from her cup. She reached out, her large calloused fingers wrapped around the hot tin. She lifted the cup to her lips and took a long, slow drink. She set the cup back down on the table with a soft metallic clink. She looked across the table at the gray-haired man sitting opposite her. There were no apologies spoken. There were no declarations of forgiveness. The ghosts of Ash Valley would always sit in the corners of the room, silent and unforgotten. The past could not be burned away in a fireplace, and it could not be drowned in a swamp. It could only be carried. But as Gideon picked up his own cup, the warmth of the metal seeping into his scarred, calloused palms, he knew he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the muddy tracks of the past. The farm was isolated, fortified, and quiet, and the front gate, reinforced with new heavy cedar posts, was left unlocked.